Sapien's one-page summary. Sapiens Part 1, Revolution of the Mind, Chapter 1, An Insignificant Species. In Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari uses concepts from physics, chemistry, biology, and history to tell the story of us, Homo sapiens. Our history is punctuated by four major revolutions: the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and the scientific revolution. Part 1, Chapters 1 to 4, explores the cognitive revolution and the events leading up to it. We'll look at each revolution and how it dramatically redirected the course of human history, but to understand these upheavals, we need to go back to a time when Homo sapiens was just one of multiple human species, and not a very distinguished species, at that. New section, Multiple Human Species. We think of our own species as the only humans, distinguished from and superior to every other species on Earth. But when we, Homo sapiens, arrived on the scene 2.5 million years ago, we weren't anything special. We existed in the middle of the food chain, as often prey as we were predators, and we weren't even the only humans. The 8 human, Homo, species. Humans evolved in East Africa from a genus of apes. These early humans settled all over the world, and as the climates and conditions differed from place to place, they acquired different traits and became different species. We tend to think of the evolution of humans as a linear progression from Homo erectus to Neanderthals to Homo sapiens, but at least 6 human species were alive when our own lived on Earth, and others may yet be discovered. The known human species included Homo soloensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo denisova, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo ergaster. The 3 that will play the biggest roles in this book are: 1. Homo neanderthalensis, man from the Neander Valley, also known as Neanderthals. These humans lived in Western Asia and Europe. They were more muscular than we were and they had bigger brains than we did, or do today. We'll see why the Neanderthal species died out, even though Neanderthals were superior to sapiens in many ways. 2. Homo erectus, upright man. These humans lived in Eastern Asia for almost 2 million years, making them likely to be the longest living human species ever. As we'll see, it's unlikely that Homo sapiens will be around 2,000 years from now, let alone 2 million. 3. Homo sapiens, wise man, us. Our species of man also evolved in East Africa. Throughout, the term sapiens refers to our own species while the term human refers to all the members of the Homo genus. Shared characteristics of humans. Of the 8 known human species, only 1 survived. Before we discuss how sapiens became the dominant humans, let's look at what all the human species had in common. Characteristic number 1, large brains. Mammals that are 130 pounds typically have a brain that's an average of 12 cubic inches. In contrast, the brains of early humans were 36 cubic inches. Today, our average brain size is 73 to 85 cubic inches, and the brains of Neanderthals were even bigger than ours. It seems like large brains would give us and our fellow humans an obvious advantage over other animals, but it wasn't necessarily an asset to early humans. The disadvantages of a big brain. Big brains take a lot of energy to fuel. Our brains make up 2 to 3% of our body weight, but use 25% of our energy. The brains of our ape siblings only use 8% of their energy. This drain of energy caused 2 main problems. Problem number 1, humans had to spend a lot of time searching for food. They needed a lot of calories to feed their hungry brains. Problem number 2, their muscles atrophied because their bodies had to divert energy from muscles to feed the brain. When you're in the middle of the food chain, trying to catch small animals and keep out of the way of big ones, using your energy to power your brain instead of your muscles isn't the smartest strategy. We still don't really know why we evolved such large brains when there was little use for them in early history. It was a bad use of our energy. Characteristic number 2, walking upright. Like having a big brain, walking upright seems like an unequivocally positive trait to us today, in part because we still walk upright and can't imagine moving any other way. There were both advantages and disadvantages to walking upright. Pros. A better view: when you're standing, it's easier to see the lion hiding in the grass or the prey oblivious to you. The ability to use tools: when you don't need your arms for moving around, they're freed up for other tasks, like signaling to others and using tools. As we evolved more nerve endings and agile muscles in our hands, our tools became more sophisticated. Cons: an unstable skeleton: because we're built to walk on all fours like most mammals, our skeletal structure doesn't easily support our large heads. Consequently, we get back and neck aches. Narrow hips: to walk upright, women and men evolved narrower hips, but this was bad news for childbirth. As women's hips were getting narrower, babies' heads were getting bigger. Narrow hips especially had far-reaching consequences for humans, creating a domino effect that led to helpless babies. This was because the women who survived the dangerous activity of childbirth, and continued to pass on their genes through subsequent births, were the ones who gave birth early in the fetus's gestation, when the baby's head was smaller and undeveloped. Consequently, women evolved to give birth earlier, when the fetus is less developed. This means that human infants are undeveloped and helpless compared with other animal infants. For instance, a colt can start to run soon after birth, and a kitten finds food on its own after a few weeks. But human children are dependent on their parents for years. The fact that human children were vulnerable for years after birth meant that human adults had to care for and protect them for years. Like having a big brain, this wasn't an obvious advantage for early humans. They needed their energy for activities like escaping the jaws of larger, stronger animals. The consequences of having premature babies. Despite the risks involved in caring for vulnerable infants, their existence created unique social situations for humans. These situations and the resulting societal bonds may have contributed to the rise of human dominance in the animal kingdom. There were two unique results of human children being born prematurely. Result number 1, the "it takes a village" mentality. Because children were so helpless, mothers relied on family members and neighbors to raise them. Many other animal genera, plural of genus, didn't have the need to form these social bonds. Result number 2, the potential for socialization. Children born relatively helpless are, relative, blank slates. As such, their societies can shape them through education and socialization to be whatever they want them to be. Whereas other mammals are born like glazed earthenware coming out of the kiln, if you try to reshape them, they'll break. Humans are born like molten glass, easily formed and reformed. New section: Last Man Standing. We shared much in common with our fellow humans. How did we rise from the middle of the food chain to the top? And how did we become the last humans standing? Fire. The domestication of fire changed the game, giving humans power over the natural world that no other animal possessed. Fire was a source of light. It was warmth in the cold months and a weapon in moments of conflict. You could even use fire to burn through impassable underbrush, changing the landscape to fit your needs. The most important use of fire was cooking. Cooking food made it easier to digest. Since digestion was easier, the long intestine became shorter. This development was especially important. Big brains and big intestines both use a lot of energy. By allowing humans to better digest food and evolve shortened intestines, fire may have indirectly contributed to the brain getting a greater share of the body's energy. As the brain got more energy, it got bigger. When humans mastered fire, they finally gained a key to developing dominance over animals that were stronger and faster than they were. Why are we the only humans left? Sapiens wasn't the only species that used fire. Why did it come to dominate? Early theories suggested that either A, sapiens bred with other humans, merging the various human species, or that B, sapiens were too genetically different from other species to procreate with them, meaning that all humans currently alive are pure sapiens. Both of these theories are flawed. For years, Theory B had more archaeological evidence to support it. But then the results of a 2010 project to map the Neanderthal genome showed that 1–4% of Middle Eastern and European DNA is Neanderthal DNA. A few months later, results from an analysis of the DNA of newly discovered Denisova showed that 6% of Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian DNA is Denisovan DNA. These results are still new and need to be confirmed.
Even if they are confirmed, they don't suggest a merger of genes as in theory A. Such small percentages hardly suggest that two species of humans merged. What they do suggest is that a small amount of interbreeding happened, enough that we still harbor the DNA of another species, but it was rare. The current evidence leaves us with two options to explain the disappearance of other humans. Option number 1, due to their superior tools and collaboration skills, sapiens were better hunters and gatherers, and as they migrated to new geographic areas, they outcompeted the human species that originally called that area home.
Neanderthals, who were less resourceful, had trouble feeding themselves, and they slowly died out. Option number 2, genocide.
Modern sapiens have fought wars with others because of their differences in skin color, culture, and religious beliefs.
Would sapiens be any more tolerant of humans of an entirely different species? Or maybe it was their familiarity that motivated sapiens to kill their fellow humans.
Perhaps other humans, particularly the Neanderthals, were too similar to sapiens. Neanderthals were a threat to a species that wanted to dominate the animal kingdom. What made sapiens the superior species that pushed other humans to extinction? Harari argues the most likely answer is language.
We'll cover that next.
Sapiens Chapter 2, Language, Gossip, and Imagined Realities.
The first major revolution for sapiens was the cognitive revolution.
Before that point, sapiens weren't particularly special among animals. Over time, they had evolved the abilities to cross oceans and invent things like bows and arrows, sewing needles, oil lamps, and art.
They had become humans that we'd recognize today, with our level of intelligence and creativity.
But until the cognitive revolution of 70,000 years ago, they weren't superior to other humans.
New section, the cognitive revolution.
Although the use of fire hastened sapiens' ascent, it was the cognitive revolution that ultimately distinguished sapiens from other humans. What caused the cognitive revolution? No one's really sure, but it was probably a chance gene mutation that changed the way the brain was wired. The cognitive revolution involved the development of 3 new abilities, all related to language, that helped Homo sapiens outpace their fellow humans.
Ability number 1, flexible language.
Their language gave sapiens a huge advantage over their fellow animals, including their fellow humans. Language itself isn't particularly special. Apes and monkeys communicate vocally, as do elephants, whales, and parrots.
One reason the language of sapiens was different was that it was more complex.
Rather than communicating simple ideas the way green monkeys do, careful.
A lion.
Or careful. An eagle, the language of sapiens could warn someone about a lion, describe its location, and plan how to deal with it. This allowed them to plan and follow through on complex actions like avoiding predators and working together to trap prey. Ability number 2, gossip.
A second distinction of the sapiens' language was its ability to convey gossip. We think of gossip as a bad thing, but using language to convey information about other people is a way to build trust.
Trust is critical for social cooperation, and cooperation gives you an advantage in the struggle to survive and pass on your genes. Even today, most of our communication is gossip, if we define gossip as talking about other people. If we hear from a friend that the banker down the street offers fair interest rates on mortgage loans, we feel comfortable doing business with that banker, even though he's a stranger.
On the flip side, if we hear that the banker is a fraud, we stay away from her. Gossip helps us avoid strangers who may cheat us or be undependable. Neanderthals probably didn't have the capability to gossip.
Their language was equipped to talk about lions and bison, but not other people. When they couldn't talk about others, they couldn't assess the trustworthiness and dependability of strangers. That meant they could only cooperate with the people they knew intimately, family members and close locals. Because an animal can only know so many other animals intimately, the lack of the ability to gossip kept Neanderthal groups small. Sapiens, on the other hand, could form groups of up to 150 people. They didn't need to know every group member personally to trust them. In a battle, a small group of Neanderthals was no match for a group of 150 sapiens.
Ability number 3, fictions.
A third benefit of the Sapiens language was how it was used to create fictions, also known as social constructs or imagined realities. Being able to communicate information about things that don't exist doesn't seem like an advantage. But sapiens seem to be the only animals who have this ability to discuss things that don't have a physical presence in the world, like money, human rights, corporations, and God. For instance, you can't convince a monkey to give you its banana on the argument that if it does, it will get unlimited bananas when it dies and goes to heaven.
Your negotiations with monkeys are limited because you can only promise rewards that exist materially in this world. Monkeys can't create imagined realities like heaven. Collective fictions.
In and of itself, imagining things that don't exist isn't an asset. You won't aid your chances of survival if you go into the forest looking for ghosts rather than berries and deer. What's important about the ability to create fictions is the ability to create collective fictions, fictions everyone believes. These collective myths allow people who've never met and otherwise would have nothing in common to cooperate under shared assumptions and goals.
Collective fictions aren't the same as lies.
These aren't lies because everyone collectively believes them. For example, members of the UN weren't lying when they insisted that Libya's government respect the rights of its citizens, even though Libya, human rights, and the UN itself are all imaginary realities, or social constructs. The borders that separate Libya from other countries are man-made, not physical features of the landscape. Human rights is a concept many of us believe in, but rights don't exist outside our collective imagination, and, like Libya, the UN is a social construct, an organization that has no physical existence. While humans lived without these social constructs for millennia, today, imaginary realities in some cases matter more than objective realities. For instance, the survival of actual entities like rainforests and endangered river dolphins depends on the charity of imaginary entities like the United States and non-profit organizations. Let's look at a modern example of how we unquestioningly accept imagined realities and treat them as real entities.
Example, Peugeot and the power of entities that don't exist.
Does the car maker Peugeot exist?
It must.
The corporation employs 200,000 people, makes 1.5 million cars a year, and earns about 55 billion euros annually. But in what way does Peugeot exist? Can you locate it in physical reality?
The company isn't its cars.
The cars could all go away and the company would still exist. The company isn't its employees, its factories, or its machinery. A natural disaster could wipe out every factory and every employee, and the company would still exist and be able to get a loan, build new factories, and hire new workers.
The company is not its founder, who's dead, or its managers and shareholders, who could be dismissed today without threatening the company's existence.
So how can it exist? Peugeot, as with other corporations, has no existence in the physical world. It's an idea, a collective myth we all agree to believe in. This myth is so powerful that this imaginary entity can buy property, pay taxes, open a bank account, and be bound by laws. We grant these legal fictions, called limited liability companies, the same rights as people. The concept of rights is a fiction, too.
We treat LLCs like flesh and blood people. The birth of limited liability companies. The problem. It wasn't always the case that a business owner could divorce himself from his business.
In the 13th century, before the imaginary existence of LLCs, if you owned a business, you were personally liable for everything that happened with that business. So if your product broke, your customer could sue you personally. If you borrowed money and the business flopped, you had to pay back the debt out of pocket.
If you couldn't, you might have to sell your personal property or sell your children into servitude. When you are your business and your business is you, starting a business is a scary prospect. People didn't want to take the financial risk, and this impeded entrepreneurship. The solution. The solution to this problem was limited liability companies.
The company became an entity independent of its founder, manager, or any other person or physical entity. We're so used to these corporations that we forget they're imaginary, existing only in our minds and invented only to shield their founders from too much personal responsibility.
Back to Peugeot.
Often, The problem with imaginary things is that it's hard to get others to believe them, their power comes only with collective belief in them. But in France in the 1890s, if you got a lawyer to go through the ritual required of the French legal code, another fiction, involving writing down the correct words on a fancy sheet of paper and signing it, you could create a totally imaginary company that millions of French citizens would tacitly agree to believe. French law validated the existence of Peugeot. In other words, one imaginary entity legitimized another imaginary entity. New section, Chimp and Sapiens Social Groups. We can see the advantages of flexible language, gossip, and shared fictions by comparing chimp social groups with sapiens social groups.
Chimp social groups.
When chimps become alpha males, leaders of their troops, it's usually due to the fact that they've created strong social ties with the members of the group.
But in order for this social structure to work, everyone in the troop has to know the others well.
Chimps who haven't met won't trust each other and won't know who is of higher rank. The fact that everyone has to know one another limits the troops to between 20 and 50 chimps. Otherwise, the group destabilizes and the troop breaks up into smaller troops, which generally don't cooperate with each other.
Sapiens social groups.
Until the cognitive revolution, sapiens functioned in social groups similar to those of chimps. But the ability to gossip meant that members didn't have to know all the other members intimately, they could know them through word of mouth. This means that sapiens social groups can be much bigger than chimp social groups. But you can still only effectively gossip about a maximum of 150 people. Beyond this number, it's just too hard to keep track of all the people. Even today, businesses with fewer than 150 people don't necessarily need concrete rules and a clear hierarchy to function. Because everyone knows each other well, social bonds keep the order. Beyond 150 people, the group becomes chaotic as there's no way to be intimately connected with, or gossip about, so many people. So gossip was a good first step toward creating large, cohesive groups, and, consequently, dominating other animals, including humans. But sapiens have managed to found cities, nations, and empires of hundreds of millions of subjects.
How did they cross the 150 threshold?
This is where common myths, or collective fictions, come into play. Cities, nations, and empires aren't real entities.
They exist only in the collective mind of the group.
For example, churches can hold sway over millions of people all over the world because of the belief system that binds their followers to each other, even when they're strangers and have nothing else in common. Likewise, citizens of a nation are often tied together by common ideals established by the nation's founders and the shared stories they tell the world about themselves. If we could only talk about things that really existed, like rivers, mountains, and lions, we'd never be able to form the powerful social and cooperative networks created by imaginary entities like churches and nations.
The world would be chaotic.
Although imagined, these myths are crucial. Without collective fictions, the systems built on them collapse. And as we'll see, most of our modern systems are built on these imagined realities. These myths are powerful, and the fact that they're not rooted in objective reality doesn't undermine them. Collective fictions allowed early sapiens to cooperate within extremely large groups of people they'd never met, and it rapidly changed their social behavior.
New section, language allowed sapiens to outcompete the Neanderthals.
The Neanderthals were perhaps the human species, other than sapiens, most likely to survive. As we've learned, they had strong bodies and large brains and were superior to sapiens in both these qualities. But in the struggle for dominance and, ultimately, survival, they were no match for sapiens. The cognitive revolution, and the language, fictions, and cooperative skills that came with it, gave sapiens a leg up in trade and hunting. Trade. Archaeologists find shells from distant coasts in sapien settlements, showing that sapiens must have traveled far and been good navigators. Both navigation and interaction with strangers necessitates good communication skills, cooperation, and shared myths.
For instance, you need to be able to trust strangers to trade with them.
Foreign sapiens traders probably engendered this trust by calling upon a shared mythical ancestor or god. They probably also used the trust that comes from believing in the same myths to trade information, widening their network of knowledge.
There's no evidence that Neanderthals traded. They made their tools from local materials. In fact, no other animals trade. Sapiens had a huge advantage here. Hunting.
While Neanderthals hunted by themselves or in small family groups, sapiens hunted in large, cooperative groups. Because there were so many of them, and they knew how to communicate effectively, sapiens could surround an entire herd of wild horses, chase them into a tight spot where they were trapped, and slaughter them. If Neanderthals and sapiens were living in the same area and competing for the same food sources, sapiens usually won. New section: Genetic evolution versus social evolution. Usually, it takes a genetic mutation to significantly change behavior, and that takes hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, of years. For example, common chimpanzees live in hierarchical groups led by the alpha male, whereas their relatives the bonobos live in egalitarian groups led by females.
Chimps can't suddenly decide that they too want to live in an egalitarian society. Their social behavior is ingrained in their genes.
Such a change would have to come from their DNA. Until the cognitive revolution, the social and technological evolution of sapiens also depended on changes in DNA. But the cognitive revolution, and the language, collective fictions, and cooperation it brought with it, allowed sapiens to evolve much faster than other humans. We can now change our social structures, interpersonal behavior, and economic behavior within decades, rather than over hundreds of years. Example: the power of the Pope. We can see how the advent of fictions made social evolution independent of biological evolution in the example of the Pope. In the societies of our chimp relatives, the alpha male uses his position of power to mate with as many females as possible, ensuring that he passes his genes to the next generation. In the animal world, this is the primary, instinctive goal: to survive long enough to pass on your DNA and keep your ancestral line alive. The sole purpose of gaining power is to help you survive and procreate. However, in modern human societies, power is divorced from procreation and institutions are passed along not through genes but through fictions. For example, Catholic priests, Buddhist monks, and Chinese eunuchs all hold sway over their societies.
They're also meant to be celibate.
Their celibacy isn't the result of limited resources or a lack of females.
It's also not the product of a genetic mutation.
There's no genetic basis or survival need for the Catholic Church, but it hasn't died out. It's passed from one generation to the next via stories rather than genes.
Sapiens Chapter 3: The Life of a Forager.
We've only been working in offices and, before that, as farmers and herders, for the last 12,000 years. For hundreds of thousands of years before that, the majority of our species' history, we were foragers.
We don't know much about foragers.
Because foragers moved every week, sometimes every day, they had few personal possessions. They only had what they could carry themselves, without the aid of wagons or pack animals. Consequently, sapiens during the period between the cognitive revolution and the agricultural revolution left few artifacts.
Dependence on the few artifacts discovered creates an incomplete, and even misleading picture of our ancestors.
It's also hard to talk about how early sapiens lived because there was no single way of life, as there isn't now. Still, attempting to piece together how our ancestors lived from 70,000 to 12,000 years ago can give us insight into our modern society.
The few things we're pretty sure of. There weren't many humans. The whole human population was smaller than the number of people living in Cairo today. Sapiens lived in bands of up to several hundred individuals.
Neighboring bands cooperated, but also fought.
Each band was likely independent.
They traded with each other, but weren't dependent on each other for essentials like fruit and meat.
They traded prestige items like shells and pigments.
There were no permanent homes, towns, or governments. Sapiens roamed back and forth across their territory, according to animal migrations and changes in the seasons.
Fishing villages might be an exception.
They ate broadly: termites, berries, roots, rabbits, bison, and mammoth, among other foods.
They had knowledge, there was little specialization of skills.
Everyone needed to know how to make a knife, mend clothing, trap prey, escape lions, and heal snake bites. Sapiens in the forager period were some of the most skilled and informed people in history.
New section: Foragers had a good life. Foragers had many advantages over their descendants.
Short working hours. Westerners spend an average of 40 to 45 hours working a week, and some people in developing countries work up to 80 hours a week. Even modern foragers, who generally live in inhospitable environments, hunt and gather for 35 to 45 hours a week. It's very possible that early foragers spent much less time working to find food and resources.
Many of them lived in lands much more fertile than the Kalahari Desert.
They also didn't have the chores that take up our time today, like vacuuming, paying bills, and washing dishes. Health. There were a couple of reasons foragers were taller and healthier than sapiens after the agricultural revolution.
Varied diet.
Because early foragers might eat berries, snails, and rabbit one day and mushrooms, fruits, and mammoth the next, they were rarely malnourished. They got all the nutrition they needed from the variety in their diets. Farmers, and the societies that depend on them, tend to rely on calories from a single crop, like wheat or rice.
Relying on one food means you're not getting the variety of nutrients you need to be healthy. Less disease.
Many diseases afflicting sapiens' descendants came from domesticated animals. Because their only domesticated animal was the dog, there was less opportunity for the spread of disease. Additionally, forager populations were spread thinly across the land.
Epidemics were uncommon.
Later societies would live in close quarters and unhygienic environments, fueling the spread of dangerous epidemics.
Foragers had their own problems.
Although foragers had many advantages over later sapiens, we shouldn't idealize their societies. Foragers dealt with issues that have decreased over time.
For instance, child mortality was high.
Interactions with wild animals often resulted in death.
People who slowed down the group, including the elderly, disabled, and children, may have been killed. Our ancestors were neither wholly good nor wholly bad.
Just like us, they were human, doing their best to survive in sometimes difficult circumstances.
New section: The things we can't know. There are gaps in our knowledge about foragers that probably won't ever be filled.
Was there religion? Yes, but we can't know much about our ancestors' fictions. We can make guesses about their beliefs, but those guesses often say more about our modern biases than about what foragers thought and felt.
Animism.
Most experts agree that early foragers were animists rather than theists. Animism, the belief that every animate and inanimate thing has thoughts and feelings and can communicate with people. This belief system is non-hierarchical, all beings are equal. Theism, the belief in a god or gods that are above us in status and create the universal order of our world. This belief system is hierarchical, divine beings outrank non-divine beings. Our forager ancestors probably believed that all animate things, mice, deer, and spirits, and inanimate things, rocks, rivers, and trees, had feelings and desires.
They also had the capability to reward or punish sapiens for their actions.
Because animism is non-hierarchical, there were no walls separating people from the rest of the natural world. People were not of a higher status than other animals, plants, spirits, and inanimate objects. Forager sapiens didn't believe that spirits, trees, and animals existed to serve or please them.
Animism doesn't refer to a particular religion.
Within this general concept, there were probably many religions practiced and beliefs believed by foragers.
Evidence of early fictions.
Although we don't know what early foragers believed, we do know that they had fictions. For example, in Russia, archaeologists discovered burial site containing numerous graves.